Good morning. It is March 18th, 2013. My name is Joan Racklin, and I have the very distinct privilege, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart and toes, of interviewing Dr. Harry Rozmiarek today. You are, in every single respect, a senior statesman in this field, not just in the U.S., but internationally. You are a leader. You're a very beloved teacher. You have served on the boards of more organizations than most people can count or lay claim to knowing anything about. And you've really been one of the trailblazers in the field of laboratory animal care and use. How did you first become interested in veterinary medicine?
I grew up on a dairy farm in northern Wisconsin, and I've always liked animals. But I thought that the veterinarian was someone we called when we needed help. He was always a nice man. He always took good care of the animals, and I respected that. I was interested in what he did. I got a chance to watch him up close, and I think I wanted to take care of animals at that time. It was something that I think I learned as a child on the farm.
So that was the seed, or those were the seeds of your early interest in veterinary medicine. Talk to me about how you came to understand the need for and be certainly a very strong advocate for ethics. Was that something also that you can trace to your childhood, or did that come later?
I'm not sure. I think the farmers are some of the best people that work with animals. They have a compassion for their animals, yet they have an understanding that the animal is part of their business, their livelihood. And you treat the animals well, you have compassion for them, they're your friends, but they are also your business. But I think that the interest in trying to make life better for animals came much later.
And I always am interested when I meet people who have a very strong sense of morality and ethics and integrity. I'd like to know more about their parents, their grandparents. What were some of your earliest influences that showed you and taught you how to be in the world?
My grandparents, both of my father's parents and my mother's grandparents, immigrated from Poland. They came from very poor families. And I remember the stories that my grandfather, who lived with us until he died when I was quite young, would tell me. And I didn't understand them at the time. But he said that there were different classes of people. He came from a class of people that was permitted to drive a horse and lead a horse, but was not permitted to ride a horse. And it wasn't until many years later, when I read Michener's book entitled Poland, that I understood better what he meant, meaning that he couldn't ride the horse because he was of a class that was meant to lead the horse or drive the horse. They came from poor families. They immigrated when they were quite young. And they settled in northern Wisconsin, and his devotion was to be a farmer. He was a good farmer, but my memory of him was as a very, very small child. And he was the old man who was around. But I'm not sure if that's what started my interest in animals. I think being around animals. My mother always had a different, interesting thing with animals every summer. We had the typical dairy farm, but at that time the family farm had 3 or 4 swine, and we always had baby pigs in the spring. She always in the summer would get something interesting. One year we had a bunch of day-old turkeys, and we raised turkeys that summer. We had fancy colored barred Plymouth Rock chickens, which became pets, would sit on our shoulders and eat out of our hands. One year we had a dozen baby geese. Well, we raised the geese, and my mother thought it would be fun to have raise geese ourselves. So she kept 2 geese and a gander and made a nest for them. And every morning she would go gather the goose eggs and bring them in. I didn't realize at that time, but geese lay almost an egg a day. So from the 2 geese, she would be harvesting 1 or 2 eggs every day. She brought them into the basement and refrigerated them until she had 6 eggs. But we also raised chickens, a laying flock for the family, about 150 chickens. And chickens, by nature, will lay eggs, but if you allow the eggs to gather, they will become what we call clucks. They have an instinct to protect the eggs and want to sit on them and nurse them. And clucks are not good in a production facility because they want to sit on the eggs, they try to hoard the eggs from the other chickens, they bite you when you come to gather the eggs, which was my job as a little kid. So my mother would, when she would look through the chicken house and the occasional cluck, the chicken that you can tell wants to sit on eggs, she would pick them up, bring them into the basement, put them in a bushel basket, and give them 6 goose eggs. And they loved those goose eggs, and they would sit on them devotedly. And she'd go down once a day and force them to come off the nest just to eat and drink and do things. And she'd have to cover the bushel basket because they wouldn't get out. They'd jump back in, and they wouldn't eat or drink. So she'd leave them out for 10 or 15 minutes, and then open the bushel basket. They'd jump back in. They'd sit on those eggs. We raised more geese than I can count because through the winter, the 2 geese are laying eggs. The gander protected the geese and would bite us as children if we were around the yard threatening his geese. But I think that developed an interest in different kinds of animals. We always had farm cats. My father made the statement that he'd rather feed 10 cats than 1 rat. So cats made their living by getting rid of the animals that got into the granary and did damage on a farm. We always had a farm dog that would learn how to get the cattle and be your friend. So I think living with animals was something I grew up with.
It also sounds like you grew up with an incredibly resourceful mother who had great ingenuity and a sense of fun, and your father practical and wise, and obviously all of that was planted in you at a very young age, and it has flowered to all of our benefits.
Well, the other thing that I probably should add is that neither of my parents had the opportunity to go to high school. My mother lived 6 miles from town, and the nearest school, the high school, was in town. And she offered to walk to school. And her father said that a girl of that age didn't need an education. She should stay home and learn how to cook and bake and take care of a family. And so she offered to walk, and he said she would wear out the shoes, and that would be too expensive. So she offered to carry her shoes and walk barefoot and put the shoes on when she got to school. Well, the end of that story is I've always felt bad that my parents didn't have the opportunity to go to high school. They did very well for themselves, and I've always wanted education. Was drummed into me from a little kid. Education is good. And I've always felt that. I still feel that. And also, I've always wanted to travel. I enjoy traveling. I didn't travel much when I was very young, but I've certainly had the opportunity to do it later.
So that thirst for education and that determination to become educated is something that has characterized your life, both your young years and your life throughout. Tell me, please, a bit about your education, starting with your post-high school graduation and where you went to college, vet school, and I know you've done some other graduate work as well.
I went to a community high school. It was in the town that was 9 miles from where we lived, so we rode the bus into high school. And I came from a class of about 90 in high school, which was a good-sized class. I went to the University of Wisconsin because that was the state university. There was only one campus in the state at that time, and that was my college. But wanting to go to veterinary school, the state of Wisconsin did not have a veterinary school. So I was forced to go out of state. And Wisconsin had no programs that assured you spaces in other schools. So I knew from the beginning that you better get good grades to get into a veterinary school of your choice. And coming from out of state, you really better get good grades. That growing up, I think, on a farm where efficiency is something you learned, I like to think I had good work habits and good study habits. So I did get good grades. And after 2 years, I applied to the University of Minnesota because that was close by and went to college. I can go fast there because veterinary school is a typical 4-year program. Our class was rather small. The University of Minnesota started in 1951, and I started in 1956. So it was still a new school, but a good school. And I wanted to go into a practice. I wanted to dairy practice. I had plans to be a 50% partner, 49% actually. I would be working for the gentleman that had a very busy two-person practice on the border of Minnesota and Iowa. In May of that year, I got an unexpected letter from my local draft board. And in those days, young men were drafted, and you were classified by what your occupation was. I was classified as a student, therefore I wouldn't be drafted as long as I was doing well in school and being successful. Well, the letter was a very friendly letter from my local draft board in my home county in Wisconsin, saying that they had been ordered to draft one veterinarian that summer that was coming, that they had me categorized as a student, but I was scheduled to graduate that spring. Their letter said, we assume you're doing well, and we assume you'll graduate, and we just wanted to tell you that we're not drafting you now, but there are 3 veterinarians in our county. One was in his early 60s and had a small animal practice. One was in his 40s. He had 3 children. He was the only large animal veterinarian in that area. And then I was graduating and would be their 3rd veterinarian to select from. So it was a message that I was going to be drafted that summer. So I, at that time, started looking around and seeing what the Army had to offer. And if I would ask for an assignment that I would want, it might get me to where I would want to work. The end of that story is that I wanted to take care of large animals, and if they couldn't be dairy cattle, the next thing was horses or something else large. And I found out that the Army had 2 places where veterinarians could work and take care of horses. Of course, there were no places to take care of dairy cows. And one was taking care of the jumping horses, the Olympic horses that were at San Antonio, and the other was taking care of the horses that pulled the caissons in the funerals at Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C. So I sat down and wrote a letter to the Chief of the Veterinary Corps explaining that I wanted to take care of large animals. I was willing to do my duty. I would be a drafted veterinarian for 2 years, but could I be assigned to one of those 2 locations? Do you want me to go on with that story?
Please. My goodness. Oh, my gosh.
At that time, I found myself on the 1st of July in San Antonio in basic training. And veterinarians, doctors, and dentists were lumped in the group that went to the medical basic training. So I had basic training. You learned how to wear a uniform and a little bit about things that soldiers do. And then they sent all the veterinarians to what we used to call a meat and egg school. It was a public health preventive medicine training, 16-week school, which was then in Chicago, to learn all about preventive medicine, public health, how to inspect food, how to inspect dairy products, the plants and the places that produce them. And while at the school, one day, one of the sergeants came to our classroom and asked for me to come out. And he said the general, the chief of the corps, was in town in Chicago, and he was asking to meet with me. And did I know what that was all about? And I said, no, I didn't. And he said, well, something might be wrong. So he said, have you had any interaction with the chief of the corps or the office? And I told him about the letter I had written. So he got concerned, and he said, well, we better do this in a formal way. So he showed me how to properly report, which I hadn't learned yet, where you walk in the door, walk straight ahead, do a half turn in front of the general, and walk up to the front of him, stand at attention, salute him, and say, reporting as ordered, sir. So I was a little scared at that time, and I opened the door and walked in, and I did what he had said. And when I was standing at attention saluting, this gentlemanly, reminded me of a grandfather sort of person. He was graying at the temples, and he had his shirt sleeves rolled up, and his tie was loosened, and he stood up and put out his hand and said, welcome, and shook hands. He said, we'll be informal here. And the next discussion we had was, I understand from your letter that you're not happy with your assignment. By then, I had received an assignment, and it was to work at a dispensary in Virginia. I didn't know what that was, but I didn't think I wanted it. So I explained to him in a nice way that I wanted to care for large animals. And he smiled and he said, well, we have a place at Fort Myer to take care of the funeral horses, and we'll assign you there if you'd like to. And I'll take care of that. I'll take care of that change, and you'll be getting your orders. So that's how I ended up in Washington, D.C. Excited. I said I'd love to travel. This was my chance to get somewhere that was important and exciting. At that time, I'd been out of the state twice, once to go to a Cubs game in Chicago, and once to go to veterinary school in Minnesota. So I hadn't traveled very much at that point.
Life's journeys are wonderful, magical mystery tours. What a great story, Harry. Thank you for sharing it. So start from there. You start taking care of the funeral horses that pull the caissons. And what year was this?
That was in 1962.
So,
and Kennedy was in the White House at that time.
That's what I was going to ask.
And it was exciting times. Now, caring for the horses was a small part of my job. I was the attending veterinarian for Fort Myer, which is where a lot of the high-ranking Army, Navy, and Marine generals lived in Virginia. But I also had responsibility for the public health, preventive medicine, food inspection services for the Washington, D.C. area. And that was all the plants that produced food that the military or government could buy from. And I had 17 people working for me at that time. I was the attending veterinarian. That was exciting because that was unusual to have a position of that kind immediately out of school. But I had a sergeant who was the senior person who knew the technical side of that extremely well. And I knew I wouldn't do anything wrong as long as he was there. I value his wisdom to this day. So he made sure I did things right. But part of my job, yes, was to care for the funeral horses. And there were two teams of horses. There was a black team and a white team, and they rotated. So for 1 week, the white team pulled a caisson and the black team rested. And the other week, the black team pulled a caisson and the white team rested. They were well cared for. They were healthy. And there was very little medicine to do. But it was exciting. But
sorry, please.
The thing I value about that assignment was that I had time to look around and see what other veterinarians in the area were doing. And right in the city was the Walter Reed Institute for Research, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, the Naval Medical Research Center, and less than an hour away, the Johns Hopkins Research Institute and University. And I had the opportunity to visit veterinarians who were involved in biomedical research, who were doing things that I had never heard of, and I didn't realize veterinarians could play a part in. And that was what really gave me an interest and a knowledge of what research was and what veterinarians could and are doing with research using animals.
So before we move forward into that, and certainly the current phase of your professional life with respect to laboratory animal research, I just have to ask whether or not your horses were involved with President Kennedy's funeral, 63 November.
They most certainly were, but before Kennedy died, General Douglas MacArthur was quite the hero of the military and of this country. He died the first year I was in Washington. And I was asked to go with the funeral horses first to New York City, where they had a procession and the horses and the caisson carried his body and for the ceremonies. And then we went with the funeral horses to Virginia, where he was eventually buried. That was exciting. But at that time, the ex-President Hoover was still alive and living in Iowa. And it sparked the interest about who else might want these horses for their ceremonies. And one was President Hoover. So I was asked to acclimate and go through the exercise of how we could get these horses to Iowa for the potential Hoover funeral. So I asked for an Air Force plane, and they set aside a runway at Andrews Air Force Base in the Washington area. We got a van from Baltimore that could carry 12 horses, and we contracted with the van. The van came, and we loaded the horses on the van. We took them to Andrews Air Force Base, where they'd set off an entire runway for us. And this huge Air Force plane that opened up a big flap down in the back, we drove the entire van with horses onto the plane. We drove another truck with the caissons and the harnesses and the 30-odd people it took to man the caisson, closed up the hatch, and we all took off in the airplane and flew over the Chesapeake Bay to see how the horses and the operation would go. And it was very successful. Interestingly, that was my first plane ride in my life. And I wanted to look out the window, and I also wanted to care for the horses. And I remember horses taking in planes in any kind of enclosure can become very high-strung and nervous. And if they do, their nervousness can get out of control, and they start kicking and throwing themselves around. And you have to be prepared, because in an airplane, if a horse gets loose and kicks the side of the plane out, you've got a big problem. So we had the horses in the van, and we had bands under the horses to hold them up if they should become sedate. And I had loaded syringes with tranquilizers dosed for each horse with their name on it, ready to grab in an instant and inject intravenously into the horse. And 2 horses on that trip did start to get very nervous. And we gave them a hurry-up dose of tranquilizer. So we had 2 very sleepy, languishing horses in the plane as we were driving around. But that was exciting. And excitement like that is what I wanted and I loved. And that was interesting.
That's like the best dress rehearsal story I've ever heard in my life. And I have only one quick follow-on question. Why did there have to be individual syringes with the horse's name on it versus fungible syringes? Was it based on their weight or on their, the medications they were taking for other things? I just assumed that a syringe of sedative was a syringe of sedative.
No, it's based on weight, and the horses are very different sized. And if you watch the funeral ceremonies sometime, they're going on every day, and it's fun to watch. The lead horses are quite a bit smaller, and the middle horses are in teams of 6, and the 2 in front are quite small. The 2 in the middle are middle size, and the 2 in back are heavier and stronger. And we wanted to be sure that we didn't do anything bad to those horses. We wanted the right dose, and we wanted to have enough so that if we had to sedate them all, we were prepared to do that.
So did you yourself accompany the horses to President Kennedy's funeral?
I did, but we only had the funeral in Washington, in New York first, and then in Washington, D.C. And I did accompany the horses. And I remember the funeral. After the horses went out, I was in the throngs of people. There were tens of thousands of people all over the cemetery and the area. So I saw the funeral. I suspect I would have seen it better on TV if I'd stayed home and watched. But interestingly, an anecdote that comes to mind was Blackjack was when a fallen senior officer, senior military person, and the president, of course, is the commander-in-chief of the military. They have a riderless horse, which is symbolic of a fallen leader. And they put the boots in the stirrups backwards of the fallen leader, and then that horse is led behind the funeral procession. And Blackjack was the riderless horse, and Blackjack was being led, and the limousine carrying the family was following him too closely, making him very nervous. And Blackjack didn't like that limousine so close behind and was dancing and trying to turn around and get away from that limousine. It was quite a challenge for the young man. I remember his name to this day. His name was Carson. He was leading the horse, and he said it was one of the hardest jobs he ever did because that poor horse wanted to get out of there, and the limousine was following too close. Well, of course, the public called that a spirited horse, and this was the spirit of a very spirited leader who had fallen, and it turned out to be perfect. The end of that story is that I thought it would be really nice to have the shoes that Blackjack wore in the funeral procession. And the farrier who put the shoes on the horses worked for me. So I asked him if I could have the shoes from Blackjack. And about an hour after the funeral, he walked into my office with the 4 shoes and gave them to me. And I said, gee, you didn't have to take them off right away. And his answer was, if I didn't take them off and give them to you, who knows who was going to ask for them tomorrow. So I have the shoes. I have them on a nail in the basement in my house. I planned to give them to the brand new Blackjack Museum at Fort Myer, which is there to honor Blackjack and the funeral horses. But to really end that story, I found out about a month ago, as I was preparing to give the shoes to the museum, I wanted to get a letter from the farrier, the horseshoer, confirming that in fact they were the shoes from Blackjack. And I wrote to him. He's still living in Arizona, and I reached him just less than a year ago. And I got a surprising letter from him. He said, yes, those are shoes from Blackjack, but they were not the shoes worn in the funeral. They were the shoes he put on immediately after the funeral, and then left them on for the day, took them off, and gave them to me. I found out that the day after I got those shoes, a colonel from the Pentagon asked for Blackjack's shoes, and he got the next pair. So I got the first pair that Blackjack wore after he came back from the funeral. And I did find out who has the original shoes. He has one. And the warrant officer that was in charge of the horse caisson section has one. And a couple of the young man who led Blackjack in the funeral, he has one. And one of the sergeants that was very instrumental in caring for the horses has the fourth one. So for almost 50 years, I thought I had the shoes worn in the funeral. And I found out this year that, in fact, they were not. They were the ones that were put on the day after the funeral.
I know at one point, several years ago, you told me that you had occasion to treat some presidential dogs or other pets. So if you would mind giving the somewhat abbreviated version of that story. It's a great story. We'd love to have it on record, and then we will move forward into more current.
Well, there are two interesting parts to that, at least I think are interesting. Of course, it was exciting to meet President Kennedy. I did meet President Kennedy in his office, and he gave me a matchbook from his desk that has the presidential seal and his name on it. I started a matchbook collection. It now has about 4 large bags full of matches, and my wife threatens to keep them in the shed somewhere outside because she's afraid if we ever have a fire, we're going to go up in matchbooks. But my mother and father were devoted Democrats and Kennedy admirers. My father was a pseudo-politician when he was young. He was the town chairman and the county chairman and things like that. But my mother came to visit, and I took care of the funeral. I took care of the Kennedy horses at my office. The horses at the barn, but his pets at my office. And when Johnson became president, he brought with him from Texas 2 beagles and a white collie, and wanted me to have a look at those. So they were brought to my office in this big black limousine and stopped outside my office, which was on Fort Myer grounds, right next to where the 6 lanes of Highway 50 go around the city. And they were brought into the office. We looked them over. They needed some shots and other kinds of medication, but nothing exciting. And as we were taking them back to the car, the collie slipped off his leash and ran down the street. And of course, the first thought was, oh my God, if that dog gets in the traffic. Well, there were a bunch of soldiers walking on the street, and they got the dog, and we got him back in the car. That was the last time the dogs came to my office. I then went to the White House to care for those dogs. And they were kept in the back of the White House in, I remember, a locker room in the back where I would go to care for the to care for the dogs. But it was right next to the Rose Garden, and everyone's heard about the Rose Garden. Well, I was permitted to drive my car in. They'd always look in the trunk and look at my bag, the medical bag, to see what I had and make sure I wasn't doing something bad. But my mother was visiting, and I asked if she'd like to go for a walk in the Rose Garden. And she thought I was kidding. So I took her with me, and we went and drove up to the White House door, and they came and checked us over and checked the car and drove in and around behind the White House, and we parked in a little area near the Rose Garden, and my mother and I went for the walk in the Rose Garden. That was the time that I think she decided I was going to be a success in life, because she got to walk in the Rose Garden. But that was exciting.
It's probably the thrill of her life.
And the other story was when, during Kennedy's presidency, little John was a little boy, and Caroline was still a little girl. And the president of Ireland gave a pony named Macaroni for the kids. And the pony was quarantined in the Fort Myer grounds, which I was then responsible for his care. And one thing we did was the pony was in the building we had set aside for him to be quarantined, and they were doing practice firing for the squad that goes with funerals to fire the symbolic guns over the funeral during the funeral ceremony. They were practicing, which was right next to the building where the pony was. And the technicians that were caring for the pony called me and said, "Oh my goodness, this poor little pony is getting very nervous because they're firing next to the building." One telephone call to the White House. The firing ceased, the practice moved somewhere else, and they went somewhere else. I learned what presidential authority could be. But we also then, later, the President of Ireland gave 2 fallow deer to the Kennedy family. They're small, relatively small deer, and the ones they got were young. And we quarantined them at the same place, and then when that was finished, we took them out to the Kennedy farm, which was in Rattlesnake Mountain near Manassas, Virginia. And they were taken out sometime in the early spring. And
What year? Sorry.
That was in '63. And I got a call saying that they had an upper respiratory infection. So I went out with a driver. I was not permitted to drive a car in Washington. I guess officers aren't qualified to do that. I had a driver wherever I went. And so we went to Rattlesnake Mountain, and we drove up to where the deer were and looked at them. It turned out that they had a light frost the night before, and the deer were exposed more than they should have. They didn't have the barn ready for them. They spent the night, a cold night, with less protection than they should have had, and they did have a cold. So I was just dispensing the antibiotics to the Secret Service people that were showing me around, when here up rode Jacqueline Kennedy on her horse, and little John was sitting behind her on the horse, and Caroline was riding Macaroni, the pony. And they came over and stopped, and she got off. She had a sweatshirt and blue jeans, and she walked over and wondered how the deer were, and I explained, and she couldn't have been, it reminded me of calling on the farm practice I was in Wisconsin, where someone would come over and wonder how things were. She couldn't have been more nice and courteous. But as we were discussing the deer, we both looked over about the same time, and next to the car was my driver, standing at attention. And little John had walked over and was pulling the laces out of his shoes. And this young man was standing at attention next to the Army car with his eyes looking down, and he was straight ahead, and his head was erect, and he was watching this kid pull the laces out of his shoes. So he got scolded and left there and proceeded to pick up a stone and throw it at the horse, and he got scolded for that. And I thought, how typical. He was 4 at that time. And 4-year-olds are all alike, whether they're the president's kids or not. But that was exciting. There were exciting parts to that. The part of the funeral, I should mention one more thing, and then we'll drop the horses. When we took the horses for the MacArthur funeral to New York, the procession was from the Grand Central Station to Madison Square Garden. And they took the body in the casket in the caisson. So we were there with our van with the horses. And then immediately after this was to take the body was laid in state at Madison Square Garden. And then they took the body to Penn Station where it went by train. And the horses were going to be loaded into the van and have the trip by van to Washington. One horse decided he didn't want to go up that ramp onto the van. So we got all the rest of the horses up, and he decided not to. And horses can be very stubborn. We'd get him halfway up the ramp, and he would throw up his front feet and jump backward and jump off the side of the ramp and be nervous. After about 5 or 6 tries, we covered his head with one of the jackets of the men, and we had about 10 people pushing and several pulling, and he jumped off the side of the ramp and cut the skin on his foreleg. not to do any damage to the leg, fortunately, but it had to be sutured. So here I am with about 10,000 people watching. Of course, that was a spectacle. All the people that came to the funeral were watching. And I'm trying to get this skittish horse to stand still while I put a couple stitches in his leg. Eventually, we got him loaded. But as we were loading, every time he threw up his front feet and got back, the crowd would cheer. And we were not happy about that. But we eventually got him onto the van, and everything was successful. And I remember that to this day. His name was Oscar. And I've always thought the name Oscar was somebody who was stubborn and not very cooperative. But I'm sure that's not the case.
Well, it's clear that even at a very young age, you were managing and competently handling incredibly both high stakes and high profile responsibilities. And you had referred earlier to the fact that during this period at Fort Myer, you were taking note of the assorted Army establishments, Walter Reed and U.S. AMRIT and some of the other facilities, and you were starting to understand that there was a career or a potential career for you in lab animal medicine and in research. And of course, the NIH was certainly established and grew after the Second World War, so it was a very young institution. So please start this next chapter with your next steps following this stint at Fort Myer and your growing awareness that this might be a field for you.
I'd be happy to do that. I'll add one thing before I do. I enjoyed zoo animal medicine as well. And I met Dr. Gray, who was the veterinarian for the Washington Zoo. And he was a nice gentleman and said, "You're welcome to come over anytime and go with me on my animal rounds." And I spent quite a few afternoons with him. And that, too, was appealing. But the research side, I think, is what made me think that's what I wanted to do for a living. But the one anecdote I can tell about the Washington Zoo was the day that I was there, and he said, "How would you like to go?" And one of the elands had given birth during the night, and he said the placenta was still attached. And the birth was fine, and the young was okay, but he had to go minister medically to the mother eland. So I thought that was exciting. I went with him. Well, we proceeded to, he gave me a wetsuit, a complete rubber set of coveralls that covered our entire body, and he put one on, and I put one on. And he proceeded to take pieces of the placenta and wipe them all over the suit, and without explaining. And after I puzzled over that a while, you realized I was wondering. He said that any of the semi-wild animals would detect human scent and might reject their young. So that's how we camouflaged with the scent of the placenta, to completely wipe ourselves with whatever we might touch the young. And all we did was tie off the umbilicus and remove the placenta, and everything was fine. But it makes you stop and think. What that taught me was that you better stop and think what you're doing if you haven't done it before. Because had we just moved forward and done what was medically correct, she might have rejected her young and we would have had a problem. Yes, I got to see the research that was going on. I remember a colleague, veterinarian, who I knew until he died about 2 years ago, very well professionally. He was very active in all of the laboratory animal medicine areas. But at that time, he was a young Air Force veterinarian doing operative intrauterine surgery in sheep. That was pretty exciting to me. I'd never even thought that was going to be done. But I remember watching him anesthetize the sheep, take the fetus out of the uterus, do surgical procedures on it, and put it back, and then correct the deformity that was in the fetus. That led to some of the medical procedures that are done now to correct deformities intrauterine. And that's pretty exciting. I remember seeing a colleague at the AFIP doing germ-free cesareans on mice. My knowledge of mice in veterinary school was how to eradicate them on a farm to keep them away from being a nuisance. I've done thousands of germ-free cesareans in my career. That's how you derive mice to be completely disease-free when they're coming from diseased parents or diseased mother. All fetuses intrauterine are sterile, whether the mother is diseased or not. So if you can take the young by germ-free cesarean and foster it onto a healthy parent, you now have the genetic strain that you wanted, and you have it in disease-free environment. And that's the genesis of most of the rodents that are used in research and many of the larger animals. Most of our production agriculture pigs have been derived in that way to get rid of endemic pig diseases. But I got very interested in the kinds of research that could be done and the fact that veterinarians were immunologists and genetic specialists and people that were on the cutting edge of doing the research, and that was really exciting. So, of course, I went to the Army and said, can I go to graduate school? And they thought it over and they said, yes, we can send you for a degree, but you would have to commit to more years active duty, and that's the rules. I had my heart set on being a practicing dairy veterinarian. So I chose to get out of the Army after my 2 years commitment and went to southern Wisconsin and was in a dairy practice for 2 years. I loved it, I enjoyed it, but I never forgot the opportunity to be involved in research and in laboratory animal medicine, which was in its infancy at that time. And after about a year and a half, I contacted the Army again and said, what can I do next? I want to go to school now. You promised 2 years ago that I could. Well, the rules were that you needed to be on active duty when you applied to school, and you had to have a 2-year assignment immediately prior to your application. So I was back to being a new guy. So I thought that over, and I decided to go back on active duty and apply to graduate school and go back to getting training in biomedical research and laboratory animal medicine. But I also said earlier I enjoy traveling and visiting big cities. I said I would like to do clinical work, be in a big city, maybe travel, and be in the Army. And where can I do that? Well, the answer was we have an opportunity for a veterinarian in New York City. You will have clinics, one in Brooklyn, one in Staten Island, and one in Queens. And you can live on an Army base in Staten Island and spend your 2 years. You will also be the post veterinarian for Fort Wadsworth, which was on Staten Island. So within a month, we were, my wife and I, and by then one little baby, were in New York City, which was equally exciting. I learned a lot. It was an exciting place to be. We saw over 35 Broadway shows in the 2 years. My wife was convinced that once we had a second child, we would never go out again. So we saw every show that came along that we could. But it was an exciting time. New York City is a wonderful place to live. I've often thought that to have a penthouse on the East Side and unlimited funds would be a nice way to spend your life.
So I just want to back up for one quick moment, because people who are watching this video in the future might not know what the acronyms that are so second nature to you might stand for. And you mentioned, I believe, AFIP.
The Armed Forces Institute of Pathology is a pathology training center, but also a research facility run by the military, Joint Services. And that's right in the Washington area. And it's, in fact, right next to the Naval Medical Research Center, which is also in Washington.
So from 65 to 67, you're doing your 2-year stint in New York. Prefatory to you're going back to school. So what's next?
I applied again to go to graduate school. That application was accepted. So I went to Ohio State University, expected to be there for 2 years, get a master's degree and a residency in laboratory animal medicine. That was exciting. We went there. I enjoyed it very much. But the opportunity was the Army considered me on active duty, but for all practical purposes, I was a full-time student. Didn't have to work part-time. I was on full salary. I was getting credit for time in the Army, and I was getting a master's degree. I met a wonderful person named Frank Korpenning, who was a former Army officer, but was on the faculty, an immunologist on the faculty at Ohio State. He became my advisor. I did my research in immunology, and the project I started was intending to get a master's degree, and the Army had said I could have 2 years to do this. Well, the project was much more than I could do in 2 years, and it was much more than a master's degree. So I applied to the Army to stay for an extra 2 to 3 years, get a PhD in immunology. They said maybe. At the end of 2 years, they wrote back and they said, we need you on active duty, so please conclude your master's degree and your residency, and when your 2 years are up, you come back to active duty. I didn't have a choice in that. That's what I had bargained for. That's what I went to. So I did a wonderful research program. It was far more than most master's degrees do. And I credit that to my advisor who had me on a track to a PhD program. But we did cut it off at the master's level. And I graduated and left Ohio State University and went back to the Army. I was assigned to a place called Edgewood Arsenal, which was then the home of the Army's toxicology research. It has since changed over the years, but there were over 30 veterinarians at that assignment, all military, and all in different specialties of laboratory animal medicine, immunology, pathology. A wonderful place for a young veterinarian with a brand new master's degree to learn how now to do some research. I was involved with quite a bit of research activity there. I also had a chance to study for board exams for the American College of Laboratory Animal Medicine. I had 2 colleagues at Edgewood Arsenal in the Army who were also studying, but we found 3 other young veterinarians on the faculty at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and the 6 of us studied together for boards. A wonderful way to study. We helped each other. We took and passed the boards while I was on that assignment at Edgewood Arsenal. I was there for 3 years, published a number of papers, which is valuable to a young professional. But I never forgot about the PhD that was still waiting and the project that I could pick up. And I kept applying once a year back to the Army. And the 3rd time I applied, I got the response that now the Vietnam War was an active. We were assigning veterinarians to the war theater in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia. Before I could be considered to go back to get a PhD and complete my education, they would expect me to have completed an overseas tour. They called it a long tour, which is 2 years or more in an overseas theater. And they would also expect me to have completed at least 1 year in the war zone, which was Southeast Asia. I now had 4 little kids and a wife, and did not want to leave them for a year to go to the war theater. So I started exploring what else there was in the military. And I found an assignment in Bangkok, Thailand, for a veterinarian with my background, where they were doing infectious disease research in immunology on arthropod-borne virus diseases, which were of interest to the government because of all of our troops in Southeast Asia. I applied for that job and made the best case I could, and I ended up getting that job. And it gave me the opportunity to have 2 years. I could take my family with me, live in Bangkok, do the kind of work I was trained to do and I enjoyed doing, and still get credit for being in a war zone because it was close enough to Vietnam. So the cards fell right, the stars were all aligned. In 1972, I went to Vietnam with 4 little kids and not knowing just exactly what that was. It couldn't have been a better arrangement for us. The Thai people are wonderful, gracious people. They love children. The economy was such that there was no army base or a place for you. We had to find our own house and our own place to live. But it was just expected that you would have household help. And we blundered into a family that was working for an Air Force officer that was going home. And they were looking for a new place. And we were looking for help. So we interviewed them. It was 2 sisters and their cousins who were brother and sister. So it was 4 people. And we decided we probably needed 2 people to help us with what we had to deal with in Thailand. So I will never forget going to the Air Force family's home and interviewing the people. And as I said, they were very nice. The 2 older ones spoke pretty good English. The younger 2 didn't speak any English. but they referred to themselves as number one, who was the boss of the crew, and then number two, number three. And after we interviewed them, then they went back in the kitchen and we talked about it, and we decided that we were going to hire two of them. And we didn't care which two, just so it was two. And my budget was $100 a month. And that was adequate to pay good, decent salaries for two people to do that kind of work. And I still remember they went off in the kitchen, and then we made up our mind, and they came back, and they were giggling. And I explained that I would like to hire two, and I would like them to decide. Well, they huddled in the back of the room, and the number one came back to speak for them, and she said, "Okay, we'll come." And I said, "Well, which two will come?" And she said, "Oh, no, we'll all come." And I said, "Well, you didn't understand. We have a limited budget." I said, "We can only pay two of you." And she said, $100 a month? And I said, "Yes." And they had seen the place that we had already rented. And it was a very nice area where we had the house that we lived in. And then there was a 3-bedroom house in the back for the servants. And that would be theirs. And it was much nicer than what they were accustomed to. So she said, "You give," her name was Nit, and she referred to herself in the first person. She said, "You give Nit $100 every month, we will take care of things." And we all come. So we had a staff of 4 for us, almost 1-to-1, taking care of us. We were there with a brand new 1-year-old. Our daughter turned 3 as we were moving, and a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. And normally you've got a lot of household chores to do with kids. We didn't change another diaper. We didn't hire another babysitter. We didn't do any housework or yard work for the 2 years we lived there. They were a wonderful family. They were friends. And they took care of us like we had not been used to. They taught us to speak Thai. I can speak, and my wife can speak, a relatively decent street Thai. And our 2-year-old, who was 1 when we moved, I will never forget one day when he ran into the house. And I was having breakfast. My wife was still asleep. He ran in. He had been out with the maids, and started telling me something exciting he had experienced that morning, but he was telling me in Thai. And he was talking too fast, and I hadn't learned well enough yet, and I couldn't understand. So the maid's standing there interpreting for me. And I remember thinking about that one and thinking, no, is this right, that I have somebody interpreting for my 2-year-old? But it was a wonderful place to live. I got to do field research. I learned how to make vaccines. We were developing a vaccine for Japanese encephalitis. I had an opportunity to travel to all parts of the country, and a lot of our field work was between villages. I got to go into the villages during the bright seasons, and it was exciting. But it was also good research. It was good immunology. I worked with entomologists. We tracked mosquitoes. We developed vaccines. And I have a publication, the first time that Ingwavuma virus was ever discovered in warm-blooded animals. It's a virus prior to that time, but it had only been seen in amphibians and birds. And we discovered it through some of our field studies, thinking we were working with Japanese encephalitis. And that's my...
So I now see the seeds of some of your interest in, and certainly love of, international settings, because you are one of the preeminent vets, again, internationally. Quick clarification for the record, and then a quick aside, and then we move forward. So you mentioned one of your mentors named Dr. Korpening?
Frank Korpening.
Would you mind spelling his last name?
Chorpenning.
Thank you. Someone who meant that much to you was someone whose name I wanted to capture correctly for the record. And the second comment, when you had mentioned how your mother brought different farm animals every year and you raised them in the goose story and the clucks, which was so charming and impressive. I remember you telling me some years ago that your wife Jane also took an interest to ducks or geese or chickens in Thailand, or some animals in Thailand. So if you wouldn't mind sharing again briefly that story, because it was a nice tie between the generations of women, even though they weren't related by blood.
My wife has said many times that she thought she was marrying a veterinarian who was going to both be rich and have cuddly little animals all around, and that's what she thought would have been perfect. and we're still waiting for the rich part to happen. But yes, when we lived in Thailand, that was only one of the creatures she came home with. We decided it would be fun to have, she decided, she came home with 4 or 5 day-old geese from the Sunday market. You could buy anything in the Sunday market in Bangkok. She went shopping, came home with these geese. Well, 2 females and a male survived, wouldn't you know? And they grew into adults, and they had run of our yard. Well, the females began laying eggs, and they laid them next to our house out on the lawn. It's warm all year round there, so it's a perfect place. The other one started laying eggs in another nest, and in front of the house there were 2 clutches of eggs. They must have, I think we had more than 15 in each nest. And then they began to sit on those eggs. They sat on them, and I remembered a discussion with my wife and with the maids. I insisted that I knew how long it took goose eggs to hatch, and it was 30 days. Chicken eggs are 21 days. Well, the maid said it was 20 days. And of course, everybody questioned me because the maids know how all Thai animals do. Well, on day 28, the first pecking was heard inside the little geese. We had more than a dozen baby geese from each of those clutches, and they all hatched about the same time. So at one point, we had more than 20 growing adolescent geese, and the 2 old females and the gander, and of course they were all pets, so they couldn't become Sunday dinner. So we had a big yard, fortunately, and we had a gardener to take care of them. But that wasn't the only thing my wife bought. She came home with a dozen chicks one day, day old. We got a local dog who decided that anything we owned, he guarded. And he guarded those chicks to where the gardener was not permitted to care for them until we took him over and introduced him to the gardener and showed him the gardener was a good guy. But the gardener had a friend, and that dog would not let that friend anywhere near those chicks. The chicks grew into roosters. The roosters got spurs and were beautiful. These red roosters with big green tails. And they began keeping the kids from playing because they would bite the kids and hurt them. I wanted to butcher them. You may keep this in the tape or not, as you choose. My wife and the maids all said no, that they raised them from pets and they were pets. Until one day my wife was out shopping and she parked the car in the yard and she was coming to the house and the roosters got her. Every chick grew up to be a rooster too, all 12 of them. The roosters got her and she came in, her legs were bleeding because they just, with those spurs, would scratch. I got permission to butcher the chicks. So I remember the day I stayed home to do it. The maids wouldn't do it because that was they raised them. But the maid said she would cook them, but she wouldn't butcher them. So I went behind the house, and I did this many times on the farm. We held the chicken, and with a hatchet, I chopped off its head. And as I chopped off its head, I heard this scream. And I looked up. My wife and the maids were all looking from the upstairs window, and they all screamed when I cut the head off the chicken. Well, that was not the end of that story. My wife gave instructions to the maid that when she prepared them, she didn't want the kids to feel sad about eating the chickens that they knew, so she was to cut them up and cook them. And we were sitting down to dinner one night, and my daughter, who was then about 3, picked up the drumstick and said, "Are these the chickens that used to bite us?" And we didn't want to lie to her, so my wife said yes, and she said, "Oh, good." And she bit into this chicken drumstick. So end of little kids being compassionate. Well, the next thing my wife did was go out and buy 12 more day-old chicks, thinking she'd get some females. She had visions of raising eggs. They all grew up to be males, too, and they met the same demise. But we found out then that the stupid foreigners bought whatever day-old chicks they had. The smart people specified that they wanted females or males. And, of course, the females were more desirable and more expensive. So if you bought chicks, you got all males. We never did get our females. But the other thing my wife came home with was 2 brand new infant otters, river otters. Still needed nursing. My first reaction was, oh my God, what are you going to do with those? She nursed them and got, through her mother, who is a home ec extension agent at the University of Minnesota, had a colleague who knew how to care for river otters. So she got an interesting recipe. We pulverized dog food in a blender and mixed it with ground up, finely ground hamburger, some vitamin powder, and made little balls of food for the otters as they were old enough to eat solid food. And the otters thrived. We had 2 little otters. We had a place behind the house that was intended for hand washing of clothes, and we came prepared with a wash machine. So it was a square concrete basin about 6 feet by 4 feet by about a foot deep. Perfect for otters and perfect for kids who had swimming suits on and it was hot outside. And the kids and the otters played in the water and ran run of the area. And I taught the dog to keep the otters out of the house because they were not house trained. The otters got around the dog because they knew how to open the doors. And one otter would bait the dog in front, and the other otter would go around the back of the house and come in that door. And then when the dog went after the first otter, the second one came in the front door. End of that story. The otters and the dog were never compatible, but they were our pets. And when we left, we had the problem of, and we also I had a mother sheep give birth. We had a flock of sheep as part of our hematology program at the laboratory where I worked. And we had a mother give birth to twins, one black and one white. For a reason we don't know, she accepted the white one and rejected the black one. And we were going to have to euthanize it because we didn't want to be hand nursing a baby sheep. And just as an afterthought, I called my wife and said, "Are you interested in nursing a day-old sheep?" And she thought that was wonderful. So I took the sheep home, and she nursed that too until it got to be an adult. And it had run of the yard. So now we were getting ready to go home. I applied for graduate school. I had not forgotten the PhD in immunology. So I applied for graduate school, and I now had the war zone assignment behind me. I had an overseas theater assignment behind me. I wanted to go to graduate school. I'd written to the same Dr. Korpenning, who said, "I will have everything ready for you. You can pick your project up where you left it off, and we'll have you back for a PhD." And the Army said I could have 2 years, 2 more, because I've already had 2 years. And 2 years is not enough to get a PhD in immunology. So he said, "Because we can start your research immediately, I'll buy the animals and you'll be ready to go the minute you land." So I accepted the 2 years and went back to Ohio State to complete my PhD. But as we were getting ready to leave town, we didn't want to see wholesale butchering of all these animals that were our pets. We also had a duck. And I'll spare you the story of the duck. It came as a day old, too. But so we had a duck and 3 adult geese and about 25 or 30 6-month-old geese and a sheep and 2 river otters to dispense with. And we didn't want them all slaughtered. So we started looking for homes. I found another Army veterinarian pathologist who said he rented a big yard and needed something to cut the grass, and perfect for the geese. So he got the geese and we threw in the duck. We found an old family, elderly family, a man and lady, Thai people, who assured us that they were not going to butcher the sheep as soon as we left country, but they wanted a companion. What better companion than a year-old sheep who liked people, who was going to live to be 10 or 12. So we gave the sheep to them with the promise that they wouldn't butcher it. And there was a field service American who was establishing a nature center in the peninsula between Thailand and Malaysia. And I got to know her through some veterinary work I did for the animals in her care, one of which was a parasitology exam on an elephant. But she thought it would be fun to have the otters and release them in the nature center and let them become semi-wild. So she came from Malaysia on her motorcycle to pick up the otters. And we had a local craftsman weave a bamboo basket, one for each otter on either side of her motorcycle. And she went back on an 80-mile trip with the motorcycle and the otters, and they had a good life. So we got rid of everything, and nothing got killed.
So I just want to pause and say that if ever anyone needed proof positive that veterinarians have great love for and great commitment to animals, this oral history, this segment of your oral history is about as convincing a testimonial as could ever exist. And again, I thank you. I mean, I thought I loved my dog until I heard the story of old MacDonald Rozmiarek. So we'll go forward now, but I have loved hearing it, not just because of the humanity and charm of those stories, but because some people do see research lab veterinarians as, people who don't care about the animals. And what you've just told us is so important because it illustrates just the opposite. So thank you for that.
One of the things I wanted to do, we had a large research facility in Bangkok, which was called the CITO Medical Research Lab. It was the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, then had people from each of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization countries working in the lab. But I was the director of the animal research facility there. And we had a staff of about 40 people that cared for the research animals. I wanted to train the staff and get them credentials in laboratory animal science. And I knew of and was familiar with the ALAS training program. So I contacted the ALAS organization and asked permission to translate the training materials into the Thai language, with permission then to give the exam in Thai and get credentials from ALAS. And I was granted permission to do that. So we got the training manuals. I had 2 other veterinarians in Bangkok that worked with me. We translated the manuals to Thai, and about 40 of our staff, between our staff and some of the neighboring institutions, took the course in laboratory animal technology. They all did well, and we got ready to give the exam, and I contacted ALAS and asked permission to now get the exams and translate them. They had changed their mind. They had never given the exam in a foreign language and were not prepared to do that. So I didn't know what to do, and I was very upset. So I contacted ICLAS, the International Council for Laboratory Animal Science, and asked for them to issue the training certificates based on the training. And that generated a visit by the then Secretary General of ICLAS, who was a gentleman from Norway. He came to Thailand to see what we were doing, gave it great testimony and credibility, and CITO ended up giving the certificates. But I visited there, and one employee that was there when I was there was still working and had his certificate, which was really interesting. But from the audience, one of the veterinarians that I had not remembered, and I was giving a talk at the meeting in Bangkok this past summer, and he said, "You may not remember me. I am," and he said his name in Thai. He said, "You did a lot for us in Thailand, and we appreciate it, and we're really thrilled to have you back, and we welcome you here." And that made me feel so good that what was done was still remembered that much longer.
The seeds you have planted as a teacher and leader have sprouted in faraway places, close by places, and are sprouting still. So before we stop this segment of the interview, I just want to ask if you would mark for us, please, what the procedures for regulations covering and general atmosphere surrounding research with lab animals was like in those early years in Thailand where you were doing research. And then we will have a nice plateau at which we can pause, and we'll continue next time.
I was fortunate in that I inherited a laboratory that was well developed and running well, directed by good people. But remember, when I was over there, it was 1972. We didn't have an Animal Welfare Act until the mid-60s. We didn't have the Public Health Service policy as we know it until the mid-80s. So there was no regulation and no requirement, even in our country, for how to take care of laboratory animals. I inherited a well-run laboratory with good people, but without the training and background in the more sophisticated side of how to do for animals. And we did interesting things there, like work with a milling company in Malaysia to produce good quality laboratory food of proper nutrition, which they didn't have available on the street. That turned out not to be a success, and we ended up airlifting animal food from the United States and animal bedding from the United States to Thailand. Fortunately, we were airlifting an awful lot of military supplies. Most of the bombing in Vietnam went out of a Marine Air Base in Thailand. So we had planes going all the time, and we could put things on their loads. But an interesting sidelight was we used wood chips as bedding. And it has to be hardwood chips because softwood has aromatic resins, which is harmful to the microsomal enzymes in small rodents. They had a source of hardwood. They chipped the hardwood, and we bought the bedding for the hardwood chips. That was in 1972. I was there until 1974, and in early 1974, our source of hardwood chips was no longer. We couldn't get hardwood chips anymore. And I found out that the fellow that was making hardwood chips for us was getting the hardwood pellets that munitions being sent from the United States were being sent on. And they used the munitions in the war, and he got the hardwood pellets, so he chipped them. When they quit sending bombs, they quit sending hardwood, and we lost our source of bedding. So we had to airlift the bedding from the U.S. after that time as well. And teak wood is wonderful for furniture, but it's not good for animal bedding.
So when you say that it was a well-run lab, you had a good staff, but there were no rules and regulations in place, I just want to ask one follow-on question. So what I've inferred, and it may be inaccurate, is that there was, good food, you cared about the bedding, there was water. Were there any environmental enrichments? Was there any acknowledgement of or attention paid to the psychological needs of animals? And similarly, were there concerns about pain, distress, and suffering of animals during those years, which postdated the Animal Welfare Act, but predated the regulations?
That's going to get me off on a tangent about the Army.
Okay.
The Army has always been a leader in laboratory animal medicine. In my opinion, was doing good laboratory animal medicine 15 years before the rest of the United States caught up. The best training programs were in the early days of the Army. And the Army-run program was well run. The animals were cared for. Yes, we had environmental enrichment. We had a breeding colony of gibbons, and I remember the gibbons were trained to hold you by the hand and jump up on the table. We didn't have the rules and regulations. We didn't have the Animal Care Committee that we know it now. That was first heard of in 1985. To the Army's credit, the Army had animal review committees as early as 1960s. And in the mid-70s, it was just commonplace in all the Army research institutes to have animal care committees, which were called by a different name than IACUCs, but they did essentially the same thing. And the Army was one of the leaders in teaching the Public Health Service what animal review could be and should be and how it could work. So I was really fortunate to find myself introduced to the Army at a time when this was something that I wanted to do and could do.
Thank you, Harry. Not only a very ardent testimonial to the Army, but again, a wonderful reminder of how uncommon a person and a vet you are. And we will look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, thank you.